Alrighty, this is going to be my second video addressing some of the arguments that Taylor made. This particular video is going to focus on his charges that Christmas and Easter have pagan origins or pagan traditions tied to them. This is obviously a controversial topic. It seems every Christmas or every Easter you see certain articles being pushed that promote this idea. So this will be a very useful video for Christians to help kind of defend the faith. And I'm also going to provide some resources that I think will be helpful in doing just that. I will confess that I'm still relatively new in this area. I don't know a great deal about paganism, so I recognize that the information I'm providing today is good, but I think like a year from now or 2 years from now, I will be a lot stronger in this area to build, to make larger arguments. But nevertheless, let's go ahead and look at some of the information and specifically some of the allegations that Taylor was making. Now Taylor actually had taken down the original video that he did discussing this topic, but I was able to pull off some information from his website where he made a post. And you can kind of see here that he made some various comments. He makes the allegations that the Puritans actually banned Christmas for a time in the 1600s. Then he also goes on to talk about some other aspects, such as the pointing to a LiveScience article, which states that some of these Christmas traditions have pagan origins, and then also pointing to a Guardian article that basically says that Eastern pagan symbolism is an indication or is linked to Easter. And he supports the idea that either there was a connection with Easter to the Sumerian goddess Ishtar or the pagan festival of Eostre, which was a kind of a German pagan festival. And then beyond that, he also lists a number pictures that he uses to kind of support this claim. Here's a couple examples. This one over here to the right is he's making the claim that the modern day Christmas tree is an Asherah tree, and he shows this picture as an example. Another picture that he keys on here talks about the evolution of Santa Claus, and his belief that Santa Claus has evolved originally from Nimrod down to Baal all the way up through to Santa Claus, right? And so those are a couple of examples that he keys on. He also listed some other examples pertaining to some Catholic traditions. And because I'm not Catholic, I'm choosing not to go into those topics, and I will leave that to some of my Catholic brothers and sisters to kind of address those specific points. I'm focusing more on kind of the general issues of Christianity and Easter and what connections there may be. To help me, and I will be referencing this book a lot in my research today, there is a book written by Ken Johnson who has a doctorate in theology. He wrote a book called Ancient Origins of Modern Holidays. And I really like this book. You can get it on Amazon.com or Amazon.co.uk, and here it is. And it's a fairly cheap book, and this is the Amazon.co.uk, but it's 6 pounds and 0.17, which is, and I think it's about $7.60 in the U.S. But it's a very useful book to reference. The website or the book itself is very useful because here's like this table of contents page, and you can see it lists all the various holidays that you can go into and reference. So this is a very useful thing that you can use for apologetics, because of course these issues will come up again and again, and so it is important that Christians have some awareness of these topics. One other thing that I'll mention specifically about Ken Johnson's books is I do like a lot of his other books too, so he is an author that I do recommend. In addition, I also support the Kindle Unlimited plan. If you're not familiar with it, it's simply a plan on Amazon where you essentially pay, I believe it's about $10 Let me see what I wrote here. It's about $9.99 a month in the U.S. or 7.99 pounds a month in the U.K. And what's nice about it is you can basically kind of rent 10 books at a time. And there are a lot of these type of books, like Ken's books here, where then you can then kind of read them sort of for free. I mean, you are paying that $10 a month, but I find that it is a good value if you read a lot, and so it can save you some money that way. But anyway, let's get on to the content. I think one thing that's important to do with this topic is to go ahead and define some terms early on, because the allegation here is that these actions being done by Christians are idolatry, and I would disagree with those claims, but let's look into it. An idolater is simply a person who uses an idol in rituals and or prayer. An idol is a statue or graven image that an idolater bows in front of and prays to. It is something that is prayed to or worshipped as an image of God. And now let's go look into Scripture. It says, what is idolatry? We get some ideas of what idolatry is in Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5. The first one here comes from Exodus 20, verse 4. This is coming from the modern King James Version, so it'll be slightly different wording, and it won't have this last sentence here in another translation like the King James, regular King James. So it says, you shall not make to yourselves any graven image or any likeness of anything that is in the heavens above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow yourself down to them nor serve them. And that's the key part here. You shall not bow yourself down to them nor serve them. And we see the same thing in Deuteronomy 5, verses 7 to 9. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven above, or on the earth beneath, or in the waters below. You shall not bow down to them or worship them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God. So, simply put, it says it is a sin to create an image, whether it be a statue or a picture, representing a god or goddess for the purpose of using them in a religious ritual. The term bow down and serve means to bow and pray to that image. And of course, in the Old Testament, there are a lot of gods that were created by various nations. We see examples in Moloch, Baal, Asherah, Ashtaroth, and so on. However, it's important to keep in mind also that it's okay for Jews and Gentiles to have statues so long as they are not used in a religious ritual and or prayed to. This topic is interesting, that the claims that Taylor is raising, because there was a movement in the early 20th century called Pagan Babylonianism, and it was a movement in archaeology that basically circles that claims that all Near Eastern religions came from Babylon as the cradle of civilization, and so this was a popular fad at that time, but it later became to be debunked. Because they discovered that even though that like it says here, it's true most Canaanite and Western Semitic religions were similar, it was proven that the religions of Canaanites and Babylonians were completely different. However, Pan-Babylonianism has a new definition in the modern era. Nowadays, it describes a Christian who believes most holidays and customs originate from paganism, and usually from Babylon and Nimrod. And this is essentially the position that Taylor's taking. So he'll claim, like he in particular claims that Christmas and Easter are pagan. But others might also claim that a birthday is pagan. And another example of this is the Jehovah's Witnesses. So basically the Pan-Babylonists will try to avoid these holidays because they feel it's committing a sin. However, not everyone agrees with that interpretation. Obviously, most Protestants would agree idolatry is a sin and break fellowship with Eastern Orthodox and Catholics over the insistence of using statues and icons in worship, but they would disagree with Pan-Babylonians that all traditions are pagan. For example, secular traditions are not sinful. And we can see an example of how this can come about, or like in theories, we could have the example of the 4th of July, which is a celebration in the U.S. to kind of commemorate our independence. And this celebration is a secular belief, but what could happen is that a cult could come along and start to deify it. As things go on, they start to worship, say, the statues of George Washington and whatnot, and then the Pagan Babylonian then comes along 100, 200 years later, and he would assume that the cult founded the holiday and that everything about it was pagan. They would then try to convince all Christians to abandon this holiday because because they didn't realize the true origin of the holiday. And a Protestant might destroy all the cultic shrines and idols of George Washington because those would be pagan, but he wouldn't destroy, say, the Washington Monument because he would know that it was not an idol because nobody was praying to the George Washington Monument. And so that's kind of important distinction to realize that some holidays actually are secular in origin, and then you have examples where paganism came along and kind of co-opted that and brought some idolatry into faith. And so that's a question that all Christians need to be thinking about is how to rightly divide or discern whether something is pagan or idol or secular. For example, in 1 Corinthians 10, Paul comes out and essentially says Christians can't participate in pagan ceremonies, right? Because of the potential for idolatry. So that's why you shouldn't be eating meats that were sacrificed. But in 1 Corinthians 11, Paul also says women can follow the secular tradition of wearing a head covering, even though it's not a church law, right? So notice he's making a distinction here. Since the tradition was not pagan or idolatrous, it was not forbidden. And it would also help Christians witness in that pagan society because it gives them something to kind of bond with. So it has its advantages. So in reference to our discussion today, we'll use the example of Christmas. So if Christmas with Christmas trees is pagan, we as Christians need to do away with it. But if the holiday is Christian, we absolutely need to celebrate it for its purpose of witnessing to unbelievers, right? And also, if parts are pagan and parts are Christian, we need to remove the paganism and use the Christian parts to witness. And one thing that the Pagan Babylonians have to worry about is, or have to remember is, that they shouldn't become a stumbling block to other Christians because of their lack of understanding about something that they mistakenly believe is pagan, right? Even though things might look similar, that doesn't mean that they actually are idolatry and forbidden. And yet also, you've got to keep it on the other hand, we might choose as Christians to avoid certain things so we don't give the appearance, because we don't want to be a stumbling block to weaker brethren who may not realize these things. But anyway, let's take a look. Ken's book, he mentions he pulls from another source called the Avodah Zarah, which is a Jewish book that was written in about the 400 AD, and it goes into detail giving Jews understanding on how to discern whether a festival is idolatrous or simply secular. And it lists a couple examples of Gentile festivals of the times, like they mentioned the Calendar, which is the Roman New Year. This celebrated the founding of the Roman Empire, and it was secular until Romans started to add idolatry to it. So while it was secular, it was okay for the Jews to go to, but then once the idolatry added in, it was the Jews had to kind of work around that because that wasn't something they wanted to participate in. Another example is the Saturnalia, which is the Roman winter solstice celebration. This is around December 17th to 23rd. This also originally was secular, but then paganism was added to it. And this is interesting too, because they specifically reference this one in the Babylonian Talmud in Avodah Zarah chapter 8a. It states that the original solstice celebration was given by Adam in the pre-flood world and reinstated by Noah at the beginning of the post-flood world. In other words, the original solstice celebration was godly or secular and good, but then when pagans turned it into an idolatrous festival, it became forbidden. Right? And you see a couple of examples of other festivals during the Roman times, but we don't need to really get into those for this discussion. But again, the Vada Zara, it means foreign worship, or it could also mean idolatry worship or strange worship. Another interesting aspect of the Vada Zara is it talks about Asherah trees, which helps give us some insight into determining what they actually were. And in our discussion today, figuring out, are they really Christmas trees? And like I said, it was written, and they say roughly about 450 to 550 AD, and it's been preserved in Maimonides' Mishnah Torah, right? And it goes into, they have different discussions where they say what makes something an idol, what makes an idol or an Asherah tree. And then it also talks about how to nullify idols and pagan relics, because that's something else that we see examples in the Bible where they wouldn't just because a temple maybe had pagan symbols in it or whatever else, didn't mean they just went ahead and just destroyed the temple. They would just take out the pagan symbols, and then that paganism has been nullified, and then they could use the temple again. And you see the same type of thing with other pagan symbols, right? Now, as I mentioned before, briefly, there's a talk about solstices and equinoxes. One of the claims that Taylor made is that Christmas was a carryover of this kind of pagan celebration, the equinox, right? But that touches on a kind of a specific issue, because it says, was it true? Was the first man monotheistic or polytheistic? And the Bible makes the claim that the first men were in fact monotheistic. It mentions in Romans 1:21 or Romans 1 verses 21 to 23, for although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him. But their thinking became futile and their foolish hearts were darkened. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of immortal God for images made to look like a mortal human being and birds and animals and reptiles. So you see, started out as monotheism, but then they started to take on these kind of polytheistic ideas of worshiping creation. And of course, as I mentioned before, the Vada Zara mentions that the Jews say the solstice celebration was given to Adam in the pre-flood times and then reinstituted by Noah in the beginning of the post-flood world. So once again, the assertion is that the pagans stole the monotheistic celebrations of the solstices and equinoxes and not the other way around, right? And so if that's true, then the claims that the Christians are taking stealing these practices from paganism is false, as in actually pagans are the interlopers in a process that was originally monotheistic to honor God. And we have to support these claims as we got the Essenes that practiced the equinoxes and solstices, as they had four intercalendarial feast days. Then, and this is extra biblical, but it is referenced in the Bible, the book of Jasher in chapter 2, verses 3 and 4 says that man turned from Adam and started worshiping other gods. So it's kind of supporting this point, monotheistic, and then man corrupted themselves and started becoming polytheistic. We also have in the book of Jubilees, chapter 6, says Noah reinstated the Adamic law and reordained the festivals of equinoxes and solstices. All right, and so just if you were curious or needed a refresher, here's a breakdown of solstices and equinoxes. They're basically set to honor the different times of the year. And the reason why it's an interesting read as far as why these times were honored, it was to kind of help for farmers in part so they can know when to plant and when to harvest. But there's also benefit to hunters so they can kind of learn the gestation period of animals. And so you'll find the solstices and equinoxes match up with these different seasons in the year. So like in the spring equinox begins in March 20th. The summer the summer solstice occurs in June 21st. The autumn equinox occurs in September 20th. And the winter solstice occurs on December 21st. And so now we kind of shift over talking to, let me get a drink of water real quick. Now we're going to talk about the actual Christmas tree, right? And there's that claim, oh, the Christmas tree is this Asherah tree, okay? But then the question is, well, what is an Asherah tree? So let's consider that. The Mishnah in Avodah Zarah 3.7 explains what Asherah trees are. It says there are three kinds. One, a tree planted specifically for the worship Astarte. Astarte is simply the Babylonian equivalent of the goddess Ishtar. Okay. Second example here is a tree that grew wild but was pruned and kept pruned for an Asherah tree. And then number three, a tree that grew wild but someone put an Asherah idol under it. Right? And the key point that I want to focus on here is notice how each of these examples, it's saying it's a live tree, a tree that's planted, a tree that grew wild that's pruned, a tree that grew wild that has an idol under it. And they go on to say that the first tree should be destroyed. The second tree was to be allowed to grow if new growth was not removed and it went back to its natural state, right? So just because they started to prune a tree to be an Asherah, they could let it grow back to its natural state and it's been nullified, right? And it's okay again. It's no longer an idol. The third tree was to be permitted to grow, but the idol removed and destroyed. So again, the issue is you're taking away the pagan parts to nullify the process and allow it to become part of its natural state. Because remember, there's nothing wrong in and of itself for people to have honor the creation of God, because that's part of God's creation. Now, the one thing that I want to highlight here is the Christmas tree does not fit any of these three categories, because it's not an object of worship, nor does it house an object of worship. And here are a couple examples of Asherah tree images that you might be curious about, right? And here's an example. As you can see, we call this Asherah tree or Asherah pole. You got the live tree, and they've shaped it in the form of a woman or a goddess. Okay. And let's see if we can. Here's another example where they shaped a face into a tree. And these are examples because we're kind of speculating in the past. But you see, they've carved a face into this tree. Okay. Another example. Another one here is again another kind of Asherah pole or root where they've cut it and pruned it in such a way that it looks like an idol. And then finally we have this example, and this is also common as well, where you might see a grove of Asherah trees where they take on a design and they create kind of a canopy right up here, and then you have the idol underneath. So these are all examples of Asherah trees. I think we can all agree that none of these look like a Christmas tree. But let's consider it in a little more detail, considering the Christmas tree. Christmas trees don't represent a pagan deity, nor are they part of any pagan rite, done in the accepted manner of the pagans. It's not worshipped, there's no idol put underneath it, and it's not shaped to be an idol. Nobody carves mouths, hands, or feet onto Christmas trees. And unlike Asherah trees, and this is a very important distinction, is actually the Christmas tree is actually cut down, which would end its life rather than revere its life as part of nature. Because remember, the pagans viewed the Asherah trees as kind of living shrines, so they weren't going to cut them down. All right. And like here's an example from the Bible. This is in 2 Kings 18, verse 4. It says, King Hezekiah cut down the Asherah. And notice the key word is cut down, right? So it wasn't like this was a Christmas tree and he needed to cut it down if it was a Christmas tree in somebody's house, right? You'd only need to cut it down if it was a living thing out in the grove or the forest that was being revered, right? And so it reads, he removeth the high places and broke the pillars and cut down the Asherah, right? And some of the other versions, they'll just simply say the grove, but we're all referencing the same thing. He's saying that it's time to cut down this pagan Asherah tree, right? But again, for your Christmas tree, there's no need for that because the Christmas tree had already been cut down. In fact, even if you wanted to claim the Christmas tree was a Asherah tree, you have another problem, because even calling it a Christmas tree, which means you're putting Christ in the name of it, is a desecration to the Asherah tree. So that alone is a nullification of whatever paganism you would want to pretend is applied to it. In addition, Christmas trees typically also have an angel placed on the top, or what they consider is the Bethlehem star or the Christmas star, right? And both of these, again, would obviously desecrate a pagan Asherah tree. I mean, what an offense that would be if you were a pagan. You're not going to have pagans running around with these symbols on their trees, right? And we can take a look here too, specific meanings about these tree topper examples. If we look here, it says, use of a Christmas angel as a tree topper represents to some the angel Gabriel from the nativity of Jesus. And it references Luke 1, verses 26, 27. And in the 6th month, the angel Gabriel was sent from God unto a city of Galilee, named Nazareth, to a virgin espoused to a man whose name was Joseph, of the house of David, and the virgin's name was Mary. That doesn't sound very pagan to me. And then we have the other example, Star of Bethlehem, or the Christmas star. And this is from Matthew chapter 2, verse 1 to 2. Now when Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, behold, there came wise men from the east to Jerusalem, saying, where is he that is born the King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east, and are come to worship him. Right? And you can reference the page if you want to read a little bit more about it. But the point here is these are not the things that pagans would be happy about. If they really thought this was an Asherah tree, they would be devastated, because there's no reference to it being an Asherah tree. The reality is, for the Christmas tree tradition started in the 7th century Germany, where Boniface, a Benedictine monk, used the triangular shape of a fir tree to explain the Trinity to the pagans. When Germany became a Christian nation, the tradition grew to suspending a fir tree at Christmas time from the rafters of the home. So actually kind of upside down, inverted initially. But by the 14th century, there was German Christmas plays that included the Tree of Life. These would be evergreen trees decorated with fruit, such as red apples. There is also an unsubstantiated legend that Martin Luther was the first to add candles or lights to the Christmas tree. Okay, so, obviously there's a Christmas tradition here. Now, yes, Christmas and Easter are man-made holidays by the church. And the Council of Nicaea decided to start celebrating Easter on the same day that the Jews celebrated Passover. But why is that a problem? After all, Easter celebrates the death and resurrection of the Lord, and formally remembering what God did for us is a very biblical thing to do. So there's nothing wrong with doing that. And since it is not a biblically mandated feast, there is no right or wrong day on which to observe it. And then also with Christmas celebrates the birth of our Savior. We know December 25th. We now know that December 5th isn't the actual birth date, but there's no biblical mandate on it, so there's no wrong day to celebrate it. Remember that the Torah doesn't mandate the feasts of Hanukkah, Purim, Tisha B'Av, or Tu B'Shvat. Okay? So let's now move a little bit over to the date of Jesus' birth on December 25th. The reality is that Christians celebrated this on December 25th prior to the Sol Invictus being instituted. Roman Emperor Aurelian moved the celebration of Sol Invictus from August to December, possibly the 25th, in 274 AD. However, Roman Christians were celebrating the birth of Christ on December 25th about a century before this. Okay, so let's keep that in mind. So it has nothing to do with Sol Invictus. Christians were already celebrating Christmas before Sol Invictus was changed in 274 AD to the time in December. So the question is more like, did Aurelian move the pagan festival just because he wanted to, or was he competing with Christianity? And so, again, Christians were a little uncertain on what time Jesus' birth was exactly. So they listed 3 times. And Christians, we just need to be open about this reality. So they had 3 times where they considered one in December, so around Hanukkah time, March, or in September around the Tabernacles, right? But what we can tell here from the records is we got 2 examples where they mistakenly believed it was in December, but what it shows is that it wasn't done to coordinate with some pagan holiday or compete or anything along those lines. And we got an example from Hippolytus in the commentary on Daniel, this is chapter 4.23.3 and 210 AD, where he says, "For the first advent of our Lord in the flesh, when he was born in Bethlehem, 8 days before the calends of January, December 25th, the 4th day of the week, Wednesday, while Augustus was in his 42nd year." And then secondly, we got Theophilus of Caesarea in 150, and this is in the early 2nd century. He says, "We ought to celebrate the birthday of our Lord on what day soever the 25th of December shall happen." Okay. So then let's move over to another issue, which is with regard to Santa Claus, right? Santa Claus is the another hot button topic, because the claim is, Santa Claus is supposedly, Taylor made the example that there was this evolution of characters going back from Nimrod, and Santa Claus is this modern manifestation of it. But let's see what we know. From the Christian tradition, St. Nicholas was a Christian bishop of Myra sometime dated to 490 AD. He was known to bring gifts to children, and legends abound of him performing miracles. After his death, he was made a saint, and later he became the patron saint of little children. Much later, his legend was mixed with that of Kris Kringle, and he became the figure behind the modern Santa Claus. Sinterklaas is a figure based on St. Nicholas. Another figure, Kris Kringle, the name Kris Kringle, also spelled Kris Kringle, comes from the Pennsylvania German Christians. In the German language, it is Christkindlin, I pronounced that right, which means Christ child. Originally, it referred to Jesus Christ, but later it became the name of Santa Claus. Now, the reality is, we all know Santa Claus is a fictional character. There is no North Pole and all those things. Sorry if any kids are listening in. Same goes with Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. These aren't attached. The point here is these aren't attached to an evolution of pagan characters, as Taylor would have us believe. Yule is the old German word for the celebration of the winter solstice. Later German paganism added the legend of the Wild Hunt to the solstice festival. The Wild Hunt, also called the Ghost Riders, is where Odin, and Odin was one on his list of the evolution of Santa Claus, as the chief of the gods, led a procession through the sky on Yuletide. Anyone caught out late at night may be swept up from the land of the living, never to return. And this is, again, a godly or secular observance of the winter solstice. Turned pagan by adding pagan myths to it, right? So again, rather than Christians or whoever else taking over the solstice idea, this is actually pagans capitalizing on a monotheistic idea. So really what we need to see is Taylor provides some more specific information on exactly why St. Nicholas is somehow connected to Odin and Nimrod. And I think he's going to have a hard time making his case there, because I think it's more like it's just wishful thinking of modern-day pagans. Now, he says, I'm going to sip here. He makes the argument that Puritans abolished Christmas in the 17th century. I mentioned that at the start of the conversation. But by the 19th century, Puritans actually called for formal observance of Christmas in churches. And, just because the Puritans abolished it doesn't mean that Christmas actually was pagan. In fact, the Puritans listed their reasons for banning Christmas, and they had 3. 1, no holy days except the Sabbath were sanctioned in Scripture, right? And we know that. We mentioned that before, but that's not a big deal, right? Just because it doesn't say that you can do it doesn't mean that you can't, right? So there's no prohibition against it, right? And when you think about it, celebrating Christmas is a very good example of following the first commandment, which is to love the Lord thy God with all your heart, soul, and mind, right? So that's not an issue. The second one, the most egregious behaviors were exercised in its celebration, and this is where the Puritans have a point that we need to consider, right? Because at that time they're upset because it was Christmas celebration in 17th century England involved carnival-like behavior, including role inversion, heavy drinking, and sexual liberties. And this is problematic because it's sinful behavior, and as practicing Christians, we don't want to engage in anything that's going to cause other people to sin, right? So they have a legitimate point. But on the other hand, you can celebrate Christmas without engaging in sin and giving yourself over to bad behavior, right? And then third, they claimed December 25th was ahistorical, right? The Puritans argued that the selection of the date was an early Christian hijacking of a Roman festival, and to celebrate a December Christmas was to defile oneself by paying homage to pagan custom. But we've already addressed how that this is not true, right? Because this came before the Sol Invictus celebration, right? And there's also the evidence of it pertaining to the winter solstice. So, the Puritans didn't have much of an argument here when you look into it in more detail, right? And even at this time and going on, the churches were actually split over this issue about whether to celebrate Christmas or not. Like it says, most Anabaptists, Quakers, and Congregational and Presbyterian Puritans regarded the day as an abomination, while Anglicans, Lutherans, Dutch Reformed, and other denominations celebrated, as did the Roman Catholics. But even Cotton Mather, the Puritan minister, by 1712, so this isn't even 100 years later, he already is allowing for the possibility of celebrating Christmas. So even he's going, we've been a little too strict here. We made some, we're viewing this incorrectly. And so as time moved on, the Puritans completely changed and started to celebrate Christmas, just like many other denominations. Now, he also references an article, the LiveScience article. All right, we're going to click over this. This is let's see if we can get this up here. Okay, this is an article in LiveScience. It says Pagan Roots: 5 Surprising Facts About Christmas, and it lists a number of examples. It says it makes some claims. 1, early Christians had a soft spot for pagans. Number 2, we all want that warm Christmas glow. 3, the church was slow to embrace Christmas. The Puritans hated the holiday. Gifts are a new and surprising controversial tradition. These are claims that are being made, right? And it asserts here, and I'll just kind of read a little bit more from here. It says, this is what the article's claim. It says, perhaps that's why pagan traditions remained even as Christianity took hold. The Christmas tree is a 17th century German invention. Oh, but what do we know? We already told you an example from the 7th century about the Benedictine monk that contradicts this claim. Right, so we already have competing information. But anyhow, University of Bristol's Hutton told LiveScience, but it clearly derives from the pagan practice of bringing greenery indoors to decorate in midwinter. It says the modern Santa Claus is a direct descendant of England's Father Christmas, who was not originally a gift getter. However, Father Christmas and his other European variations are modern incarnations of old pagan ideas about spirits who traveled in the sky in midwinter. Okay, so that's an interesting claims he's making. But the first thing that we need to do whenever we consider an article is we need to consider the source. Who's making these claims? In this case, the source is Ronald Hutton. And Ronald Hutton's written extensively about paganism. But if we click over here, we will see some interesting information about him. This is his wiki page, and this is what Mr. Hutton says. They say about Mr. Hutton. He says, although he has written much on the subject of paganism, Hutton insists that his own religious beliefs are a private matter. And he goes on to further down here to say he was raised pagan and was personally acquainted with Wiccans from youth. He has become a well-known and much-loved figure in the British community. Okay? So as a Christian, we need to be concerned about the source and say, is this a source that we can trust, right? Because at the very least, this gentleman here is pagan sympathetic, if not an outright pagan who won't come out and admit it. He's raised pagan, personally acquainted with Wiccans from youth. He's become a well-known, loved figure in the British pagan community, and he's wrote a number of books about paganism. So he's chosen to make his life's work on it about this topic, right? So we have some issues, credibility issues, because as Christians we should be leery to accept the word of any potential pagan, because they have a history of stretching the truth or manipulating the truth to support their aims, right? And as I mentioned before, we already showed the example where there's a competition of claims where he's saying, the pagan is saying, we'll say pagan sympathetic is claiming that in the 17th century, Christmas tree was invented, but I listed a couple examples much earlier, going back to the 7th century, where that's not the case. He also made some claims about Santa Claus and Father Christmas as being pagan, but I just mentioned earlier about St. Nicholas, who's clearly not a pagan figure. So let's look at some of the other claims that he made. Because he also said, we all want warm Christmas glow. He is saying pagans own winter solstice. But we already discussed the issue where there's a lot of evidence that suggests that's maybe not the case. And the Christian position is that it was actually first celebrated by Adam and God. And the pagans then came along later and had kind of stole that idea, right? And again, with the Noahides, they were commanded to observe the solstice by Noah. So again, monotheistic, but then it gets corrupted with time. The third claim says the church was slow to embrace Christmas. But we already discussed this point earlier. He said this isn't consistent with what the early church fathers, Hippolytus in the 3rd century and Theophilus, said in the 2nd century. So it'd be interesting. Like I said, I'd need to know a little bit more about Hutton and how do you come to these conclusions. And it's not in the article, but we need to see the work. Just like in math class, we need to see the work that he's bringing to these conclusions. He also makes another claim. He repeats the claim about Puritans banning it. But as we know already, the Puritans changed their mind, and I don't think that their arguments for originally banning it hold up to scrutiny, right? And finally, he claims gifts are a new tradition. But of course, we already know about St. Nicholas giving gifts to children, and that was back before 490 AD. So I think that he would need to show more work to kind of support some of these claims, because we have evidence that contradicts some of the claims he made. Okay? And now we're going to move over to the Easter portion. And we're going to read from the Easter section in Ken Johnson's book. So you get to see this in action. All right. And so this is the claims that he's making in his book. He says, from the time of Egyptian Exodus, Jews have celebrated this time period with a ritual called Passover. Christians believe that the ritual of the Passover Seder predicted the death, burial, and resurrection of the Messiah at his first coming. Some people have noticed that the word Easter sounds like it might have come from the pagan Babylonian goddess Ishtar, or the Germanic goddess Eostre. And again, these are the claims that Taylor's making. However, they point out there is no connection with Easter and Ishtar, but the word Easter seems to be connected with Eostre, right? And they go in and they reference that there was a medieval English monk named Bede. This is in the early 8th century AD, and it basically says that here the month of April was called simply Paschal month by the English Christians at that time. The old pagan name of the month of April was Eostre. Okay, and where this is going is there's a question that says either the old English month of April was named after a spring goddess, or more likely it was named after the season of spring, and later pagans turned the spring season into a goddess they worshipped. And if it's the latter, the word Easter has no direct connection to paganism. Okay? And then we'll also kind of briefly touch on the Easter egg. Now, and I'll just keep reading here. On Passover, the Jews perform a ritual meal called the Seder. The Easter egg comes from this Passover Seder ritual. There is a special dish used for the ritual called a Seder plate. It holds several items. One is an egg. The Passover Seder egg is an egg roasted brown by fire, symbolizing the temple sacrifices. As Christians, we hold that the temple sacrifices were rituals that pointed to the one sacrifice of the Messiah. The Easter egg, as we know it, came into being when the Eastern Orthodox Church started coloring their hard-boiled eggs red, stating it represents a new life in Jesus Christ because of his bloodshed as a sacrifice for our sins. Cracking the shell and taking the egg out symbolizes the same thing as the Passover Seder ritual of retrieving. Right? The hidden matzah that was wrapped in a white cloth, the resurrection of the Messiah. And then Dr. Johnson says, did they have the authority to change the ritual? Maybe, maybe not, but the practice did not come from paganism. And then it goes on and says, for the last 100 years, Easter eggs have taken on more colors and become increasingly secular. And then we also get into this talk of the Easter bunny. He says, since all nations had to closely observe the spring equinox for planting and hunting, along with looking for the spring equinox. In some areas, the people would look for animals to start having young. Rabbits and hares reproduce quickly, so a baby rabbit is a sure sign spring has come. Bird eggs are another sign. Later, when the pagans started worshiping the spring season as a goddess, it might have been adapted into some pagan systems. But there is no known manuscript glyph or stone carving that connects Ishtar with rabbits. The goddess Asherah is connected with lions and owls, but not rabbits. There are no known records of any kind about the rites of Eostre. So I'll repeat that again because Taylor was making the claim of connecting Ishtar to Easter. Again, there is no known manuscript glyph or stone carving that connects Ishtar with rabbits. The goddess Asherah is connected with lions and owls, but not rabbits. There are no known records of any kind about the rites of Eostre. Okay. I want to see if there's anything more I want to add to this. Okay. Now go ahead and just finish up this last portion since it's short. Rabbits were a popular motif in medieval church art. In ancient times, it was widely believed, as by Pliny, Plutarch, Philostratus, and Aelian, that female rabbits could reproduce without the aid of a male rabbit. Of course, this is not true, but the idea of reproducing without the loss of virginity led to rabbits being associated with the Virgin Mary. Rabbits are often found in Northern European manuscripts and paintings of the Virgin and Christ child. The triple rabbit became a Catholic symbol for the Trinity and is found on many cathedrals in Europe. By the 17th century, the Easter bunny and Eastern eggs began to blend in Germany. These traditions came to America with the German immigrants in the mid-19th century. Shortly thereafter, children's stories of a rabbit that lays eggs came to be. Okay. Now, Taylor, to make his argument of that Easter is a pagan holiday, he quotes an article from The Guardian, and it's written by Heather McDougall. And so again, the first thing that we want to do when we're ever considering a source is, does the source have credibility? Now, looking into Heather McDougall, I discovered that apparently she studied Catholicism and Buddhism in her studies, which I find is kind of an interesting combination. Now, maybe perhaps she had the idea that she was going to be evangelized to Buddhists or become a missionary in a place like China that has a lot of Buddhists, but for whatever reason that didn't materialize. But an alternative theory is you want to have to ask is, if you're practicing Catholicism or learning about Catholicism and Buddhism, those aren't consistent ideas, right? They're at odds with each other, and they have certain beliefs that are at odds. So that's a strange thing to me. Like it's almost like she's not sure what her belief system is, right? And it would be nice to get some more information about her to kind of see what this is, but there isn't a lot of information. It seems that she essentially wrote for The Guardian several articles during the years of either 2010 or 2011, but after that, it's can't find anything else on her. I can't find any books. And the best I could do is several years later, I found a comment in a post about her saying that she might have been in some type of abusive relationship. And all this isn't for me to say to criticize her so much as just to say, is she a credible source? And the reason why I think that she is not is there's another gentleman, another Catholic named Roger Pierce, who challenges some of her claims. And I wanted to kind of pull up. Well, first I'll point out that her article here, right? It's a relatively short article, but it's the type of article that gets a lot of attention, and it's turned out by the Guardian. And notice it's got 311 comments. So, and this was written around April 3rd, right before Easter. So let's see what Mr. Roger Pierce has to say about the article. And I thought this was interesting discussion as well. And I'm kind of curious for people who live in the UK to kind of, is this a common pattern? Is this truly a thing, or is this just his opinion? He says, when I was young, I used to believe that the British press was independent and derided claims of establishment control as being conspiracy theories. Since those happy days, I've watched several examples of three-line whips where suddenly the press starts to talk in set phrases, right? And he gives several examples. Then he gets over to the relevant part for us. He says, a further established tradition is to mark major Christmas festivals by running knocking campaigns. Every Christmas, every Easter, one or the other organs is put up to attack the Christians. I gather that BBC Radio 4 is currently doing a series which I have seen described as ridiculously false, but I haven't heard it. Usually one or the other of the major newspapers will run an article slagging off the Christians and debunking their religion. And so I'm just curious to the audience, is this true or not? All right? Because it sounds like that it is. And he goes on to say this year, and he's mistaken because this article had been written in 2010, but he says this year the baton has been picked up by the Guardian newspaper in London. On Easter Saturday, they published an article by a certain Heather McDougall. All right, it rejoices in the title, The Pagan Roots of Easter. All right. And he goes on to say, Easter is, of course, the festival of Christ's death and resurrection. Malicious or dishonest but unscholarly writers all over the internet peddle falsehoods about how it is really just a pagan festival in drag. The object, of course, is to undermine the truth claims of the Christian religion. The suggestion is an insinuation of borrowing and therefore of falsity. Yet fairly obviously, the question of when Christ died is a historical question, amenable to standard scholarly methods, yada yada. But to ask the question is to answer it, and answer it in the negative. But logic has little to do with this, so the argument is kept as an insinuation. Few of these nasty individuals know much history even about their own argument, as otherwise they would know that claims that Catholic festivals were merely pagan festivals renamed was a stock argument of 19th century anti-papist invective. Okay, so he's got some strong words, and you say, well, okay, well, who's this guy? This is a good question, but let's see what he has to say about Heather McDougall's work. And he starts to look at some issues, right? And in Heather McDougall's article, she makes a claim. Today we see a secular culture celebrating the spring equinox, whilst religious culture celebrates the resurrection. And Roger makes a comment, Dewey, I've never met any normal person celebrating the spring equinox. As for religious culture, why can't the author say Christians? Because it sure as heck isn't the Muslims doing so. But the reason, of course, is animosity. And this is a really good point. Why in the world is she phrasing this language in this way? What's wrong with saying Christian culture, right? So you're already seeing an example of some weird indoctrination going on where you can't say that black is black and white is white. And so that's very disturbing, right? So there should be a red flag should be raised immediately. Okay? But we go on, right? And McDougall says, However, early Christianity made a pragmatic acceptance of ancient pagan practices, most of which we enjoy today at Easter. And Piercy says, unfortunately, this vague claim is entirely without evidence, to the best of my knowledge, and what follows will make anyone with any knowledge of antiquity blush. McDougall then says in an article, the general symbolic story of the death of the sun, S-O-N, to sun, S-U-N, on a cross, the constellation of the Southern Cross, and his rebirth overcoming the powers of darkness was a well-worn story in the ancient world. And Roger goes on to say, yes, she really suggested that a narrative relying on sun, S-O-N, and S-U-N is ancient, something about the ancient world. That the ancients did not speak English, she does not seemingly know. Ouch. So and this is a very good point, because this kind of runs past people here. This connection that they're making only makes sense in the English language. In other languages, this isn't going to work out, right? But they're floating that there's this connection. But then also, this says, likewise, I thought everybody knew that the Southern Cross is only visible south of the equator, which that's an interesting claim. So I fact-checked him to see what's to say about this. And the crux, which is another word for the Southern Cross, it says is easily visible from the southern hemisphere at practically any time of year. It is also visible near the horizon from the tropical latitudes of the northern hemisphere for a few hours every night during the northern winter and spring. Okay, so he's correct in saying that typically you see this in the southern hemisphere, but there's only a brief period in the tropical latitudes, or what we call this area right here, which is the subtropics, right? This is interesting because they're advocating this as a Babylonian religion, but if you can't quite see it here in the map, but Babylon is actually above the subtropics, so it wouldn't be visible there either. All right, so we have at the very least we have some reasons to question Heather's work in this area. This is a question that begs more information, and so already I feel we have enough information where we can stop generally giving her the benefit of the doubt and saying her work is sound, because now everything that she says is suspect because of these other errors that she's made in her writing. Now, like I said, like he goes on to say a great deal. I'm trying to see if I want to kind of go into it. And I think what I'm going to go ahead and do instead of kind of accept all these things is I haven't fact-checked every claim that Roger Piercy is making this claim, but I will provide a link where you can kind of go look at it, all the points that he makes going line by line. But what I think I've established so far is there's enough reason to call into question Heather McDougall's article here, and it shouldn't be accepted as sound argumentation. Okay. Another article that I think is more substantive on this issue, this comes from a Christian history magazine. The article was Easter Borrowed from Another Pagan Holiday. And I'll provide a link to this as well, but it comes into their portion right here. And again, it was written by an Anthony McRoy. This is back in 2009, so this is actually even before McDougall's article. But it says here, the first question, therefore, is whether the actual Christian celebration of Easter is derived from a pagan festival. This is easily answered. The Nordic or Germanic peoples, including the Anglo-Saxons, were comparative latecomers to Christianity. Pope Gregory I sent a missionary enterprise led by Augustine of Canterbury to the Anglo-Saxons in 596, 597 AD. The forcible conversion of the Saxons in Europe began under Charlemagne in 772. Hence, if Easter, the Christian Passover festival, was celebrated prior to those dates, any supposed pagan Anglo-Saxon festival of Eostre can have no significance. And there is, in fact, clear evidence that Christians celebrated an Easter or Passover festival by the 2nd century, if not earlier. So it follows that the Christian Easter or Passover celebration, which originated in the Mediterranean basin, was not influenced by any Germanic pagan festival. So what they're saying is the ties or the claims that Eostre was the festival that tied into this, it goes away. All right. And the rest of this article, I also find very interesting as well. It goes into kind of the name issues, and interestingly enough, old Professor Ronald Hutton, who is the pagan source of the other article, is actually being listed here as a couple times where he challenges, is used to kind of challenge some of the pagan claims made. So I won't go into it here because this video is already running long. But this is something else that you'd want to take a look at and read in more depth. And this is something that you want to save and have available, because as Christians we need to have this information armed. So when these pagan claims come up, we can knock them down before they gain any traction. Okay. So now I'll just hint at something else too that I always find kind of weird about this idea that Easter egg hunts or these pagan practices. Well, admittedly, I haven't gone to all the churches in the world, but for my church, the one that I grew up in, the Easter egg hunts wasn't a part of the formal service in any capacity. The formal service was simply to honor Jesus Christ and have their kind of traditional service. The Easter egg hunt itself was simply, essentially, basically a secular event that kids participated in, kind of usually after the service, right? I can say with absolute certainty, I never heard the term Ishtar or any other pagan goddess or anything that could be construed as anything like some type of pagan rite or ritual in these Easter egg hunts. The aim, as far as I remember, was simply to get as many eggs as you could, because you wanted to eat up all the chocolates or gummy bears or whatever might be contained in the Easter eggs. Nobody said, I'm doing this for Ishtar or any of this nonsense. So I think Taylor or anyone else is going to be really hard pressed to show that these even the Easter egg hunt has these pagan ties that somehow honors their gods, because it just doesn't happen. I would say that even just calling it Easter egg hunt again nullifies this practice that is somehow tied to Ishtar or Eostre. All right. Okay. So we covered a bunch of material. So I hope that y'all haven't fallen asleep or clicked off. But these are some questions that I have for Taylor that I think that he needs to kind of think about regarding these issues. One is in this discussion, there's kind of interesting seeming paradox. Taylor rejects. He's gone on record. In my other video, he said he rejects the teachings of the early church fathers as pagan. He won't accept them. But here in this video, he readily accepts the teachings of an actual pagan, which is the Richard Hutton guy, regarding Christianity, and then accepts the words of a Catholic or Buddhist, which he would also consider to be a pagan. That's the Heather McDougall. So why does he accept the latter? Why is he accepting pagans now, but he wouldn't accept the early church fathers before? My opinion is that it's just because these pagans support the beliefs that he has or he wants to believe in. Really, if pagans are bad or wrong and so on, he shouldn't be accepting these what he considers them to be pagans either, and yet he does. A second question. So my question on that is just like, why is he accepting them as sources, as credible sources? He's a Christian. He's following the biblical teaching. He should be following those who share those beliefs, not pagans. Another example I'd be just curious to ask him about is, would he consider a statue of George Washington or, say, Lord Nelson's column at Trafalgar Square to be considered idols? I personally would say no, because they are secular. Only if there was some type of idolatry added to it would it become sinful. Another example I would ask him is a Christian nativity scene idolatry, if they aren't praying to it or using it in a religious ceremony? And then a couple other ones that I think will be very interesting to get his thoughts on is, what about other special days like birthdays or Mother's Day? Because again, these are also things that sometimes you'll see pagans write articles about as well. Are these pagan? Does the fact that there may have been a pagan holiday way back in the past that is somehow similar to a holiday today, does that automatically make it pagan? After all, Jews celebrated birthdays in the past and other special days like bar mitzvahs and bat mitzvahs. So it's an interesting question. And then also, what if some pagan act happened first in time, like way back when? Does it always trump something that came later, even if it has no apparent relation to the symbol? For example, the satanic sign of the horns or devil horns, is a symbol like this. The Satanists, they would believe that this is, pagan symbol sorts. Of course, for Texas Longhorn fans, this is the hook 'em horn sign. It's a sign they use to celebrate their team in games. And so my question is, is that okay? Are all those Texas Longhorn fans automatically pagans because they do that hand signal? Or what about the okay hand signal? Is it also banned or considered idolatry because Satanists would say that it's a 666 hand signal? So with these things, does it matter what the intent behind the action is? Or is it just simply that pagans can somehow act like some type of kind of patent troll on all these things, right? Because they might have done it some way back in that somehow negates everything. And I go on to say, so are they essentially allowed to stop all these actions in the future because they may have done some things in the past? I think this is a challenging point for you, Taylor, because if we apply reductio ad absurdum to this argument, I think we'll find you can't live this idea out that just because the pagans might have done something in the past, and that means somehow all ideas in the present can't be done without them becoming idolatrous. Because then you could say, well, the pagans had sex, so now we can't have sex. The pagans ate food, so now we can't eat food. Or the pagans sat in chairs, and so now we can't have chairs, right? So I just think it's gonna if you try to live that example out, it's gonna lead to just these absurd conclusions. Plus, and as I say here, there has to be more reason applied to this thinking because you would be limited in what you could do, especially if you claim polytheism was first. So, like I said, it'll be interesting to see what you make of these questions, but if you choose not to answer them, then at the very least, I hope this is information that Christians can use to kind of challenge these claims about paganism ties to Christmas and Easter. All right, thank y'all.